As said, my name is Miquel Garcia. I'm the Antigua Marine Conservation Programme Coordinator at the Environmental Awareness Group. We're an NGO based in Antigua and Barbuda. So, yep, we could get right into it. So, a quick introduction to the Environmental Awareness Group, the EAG. We are Antigua and Barbuda's oldest environmental NGO and has been at the forefront of conservation work within the islands for over 30 years. Our tagline is for the benefit of people and wildlife, and we have three core programs. We have the Offshore Islands Conservation Program, we have the Redonda Ecosystem Reserve, and then the Antigua Marine Conservation Program. And I'll go a bit more in depth into each one of them in a bit. Yep. So the general pillars of the Environmental Awareness Group are ecosystem-based endangered species conservation, invasive alien species management, education and awareness, and protected area management. So these are some of the core focuses that we gravitate towards at the Environmental Awareness Group. We're actively working with endangered species. We're working with sensitive ecosystems to important birding areas to key biodiversity areas, and then we also do a lot of work within protected areas around Antigua and Barbuda, and we're actually the managing agency behind one of them. Again, I'll go a bit more in depth into that in a bit. Next slide. So just to give a more of an introduction into each one of our core programs, the Offshore Islands Conservation Program was one of the first programs at the EAG that kind of kicked off everything with the conservation of the Antigua racer. So originally, EAG has been more of a land-focused, island-focused conservation organization where around Antigua and Barbuda, there are 51 offshore islands, and we saw issue specifically with the Antiguan racer, where it was previously one of the world's most endangered snakes. That was its title. The population in the wild was at 30 left. It's an endemic species to Antigua. There were 30 snakes left in the wild around the world, and then through the efforts of EAG by reintroducing them onto offshore islands and keeping those islands rat and invasive species free, we were able to bump up those populations from the initial 30 to 1,000, and we're still doing ongoing surveys to manage the population of this critically endangered and endemic species towards Antigua and Barbuda. So what this work has led us to doing is a lot of invasive species control and monitoring. So rats, mongoose, in some cases goats, we manage these species and allow the environment by the removal of these invasive species that have a detrimental impact to the natural environment. By removing them, we're able to allow the ecosystem to breathe and to be able to rebound. So just by removing rats, mongoose on some of the offshore islands, we're able to see huge increases in the nesting bird populations, our Antiguan racers doing well, and then on islands like Redonda, you start seeing it's creating a safe haven for seabirds, seabird nesting colonies, the endemic lizard species on the island, and then those would have trickle-down impacts into the surrounding marine environment just through how good the land is doing. So the Offshore Islands Conservation Program is focused on some of the many offshore islands operating within the Northeastern Marine Management Area, which is a large protected area in Antigua and Barbuda. So next slide. Next up is the Redonda Ecosystem Reserve. So this is a picture of what Redonda used to look like. I'm going to show a more updated picture in a bit. So remember, this is what it would have looked like just a few years ago. It was classified as a moonscape. There was barely any vegetation, and this was due to, again, rats, mainly rats and goats acting as invasive species that basically ate everything on the island, from the birds coming into nest to any vegetation and plant life, and it really became a dead environment. Through the work of EAG, we were actually able to remove the invasive species, and just from doing that, the island started to rebound. You had an influx of new vegetation coming in, and with more vegetation, more trees growing on the island, you had huge returns of migratory seabirds, different seabird colonies, and the populations of the endemic lizard species on the island also rebounding. With that rebound, you have an increase in the nutrients being produced. So Redonda it was initially used as a guano mining island just because of how high the nesting seabird populations were. There were very high amounts of guano on the island. As a result of all the mining, the introduction of invasives, most of that was lost, and then the surrounding ecosystem suffered because of that. Because of the work EAG has done, you have a return of the seabirds, you have a return of nutrient inputs, and not just, so there's a difference between nutrient inputs where you have inorganic fertilizers that you might be coming from washing offshore as runoff from farms, and then you have another one which is a natural input of nutrients from seabirds. So the nutrients from seabirds, there's a lot of research showing that they're directly the kind of nutrients that are easy for coral reefs, for corals to uptake and healthily grow, for seagrass beds. So just by removing rats, we were able to restore not only the land environment of Redonda, but also we're starting to see a positive change in the marine environment of Redonda. Next slide. And then for my program, the Antigua Marine Conservation Programme, we are dedicated towards ecosystem-based protection, but our species of focus is the various species of sea turtles that inhabit around Antigua and Barbuda. So we have 3 nesting species, the hawksbill, green, and leatherback, and then we also have another species within our water, the loggerheads. So the AMCP program is dedicated towards sea turtle conservation, but not just the sea turtles, the entire ecosystems they exist around. So this one is more based on mainland Antigua, where we're doing mainly nesting beach surveys and trickling into in-water work. And as you do more in-water work, you identify the areas that sea turtles forage within. Then you start identifying, okay, they spend a lot of time around this coral reef. They spend a lot of time around this seagrass bed. And then you start building connective maps between the areas that they tend to frequent around the island, and then you build a course for protecting the entire ecosystem, just because we know that this is a internationally protected IUCN endangered species. Next slide. So going a bit deeper into how multilateral agreements guide EAG's work. So being completely honest, the team on the ground is focused on what we do and what we love to do, which is species conservation. We love being out on the field. We love doing the work, doing bird checks, watching sea turtles come up to nest, active conservation. Our ethos at the EAG is doing something to make a change. So most of the time, our team is within the field actively engaging in the work that has to be done. There are several multilateral agreements that tie in very nicely with the work that we're already doing. In some cases, with like the Cunning Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, there are certain targets that we as the EAG are consistently hitting, and that are our core focal points and areas. And I'll just point out some of these targets that we actively hit, and it's not just us hitting it to say that we are doing a checkbox. We're doing the conservation work in a way that supports any multilateral agreement the government buys into. So the government would always have their top-down directives of, okay, we need to put more work into conserving or identifying areas to conserve, or we understand that invasive species within the Caribbean is an issue. We need someone to do something about that. EAG is the organization that puts feet on the ground and actually does the work to make sure that these targets are hit. So target one is the planning and management of all areas to reduce biodiversity loss. We work not only around EAG, around Antigua, we work on the offshore islands, we work on Redonda, and we make sure to make this work as inclusive as possible to make sure that the volunteers, citizens of Antigua and Barbuda, interested tourists are all getting an ecosystem package and understanding the importance that goes in, the importance and work that goes into protecting and managing these areas, and then the importance of making sure that we keep these species around for the long term. The restoring degraded ecosystems. This is where our work on the offshore islands or Redonda is, it shines through the most and it hits the target on the nose of restoring degraded ecosystems. We've learned through our 30 years of experience that in most cases, you just need to tweak the negative issues impacting the ecosystem. So just by removing rats and goats from Redonda, we didn't do any active conservation methods like replanting trees or reintroducing species. Just by removing the rats and goats, allowing the vegetation to return, you naturally saw increases in the biodiversity of the area and the ecosystem health of the area. So just by identifying the key causes, the main impacting factors, and putting our heads together using our regional support and our international support networks, we're able to actively contribute towards the restoration of degraded ecosystems. And if you look at Antigua and Barbuda, in general, EAG is the leading organization, even as an NGO or non-governmental organization, we're the leading entity in the charge for Target 2. For Target 3 now, so the conserve 30% of land, water, and seas, so the 30 by 30 goal. Antigua and Barbuda has met the 30 by 30 goal, and the reason they met it is the designation of Redonda as a marine protected area, as an ecosystem reserve, where it's now one of the largest marine protected areas in the Caribbean, with as 30,000 hectares. We not only met the standard, we're also working towards ensuring that these areas are properly managed, because, I mean, everyone here should know that just drawing a circle around a key area and saying it's a protected area, that's the first step. That's usually really hard to get done, but it's still only the first step. The steps that come after, proper management, monitoring, actually observing the ecosystem to ensure that, you know, we protected this area, we know there are critical species within this area, and now the next steps is to ensure that we are actually we have a positive impact after drawing this protected area designation. So EAG is the managing agency, so as a NGO, we're the managers of this, and it's written into law in Antigua and Barbuda. And then halting species extinction. So our work directly with species like the Antiguan racer, which is an endemic species, like the hawksbill sea turtles, with leatherback sea turtles, green sea turtles, with many of the nesting seabird populations, the West Indian whistling duck, the endemic species within Redonda. Through our work, we're actively halting species extinction. And then the reduction of the introduction of IES, so invasive alien species, by 50%. Our work with creating biosecurity protocols for the offshore islands, for Redonda, ensuring that the offshore islands remain rat mongoose free, and allowing the ecosystems as themselves without those negative alien impacts to rebound and positively grow. So there are a lot of targets that we hit as the environmental awareness group, as an NGO, who were not necessarily always on the policy, on the multilateral agreements, usually it just trickles down to us to say, okay, this is something that the government has signed on to. These are targets that we hit to miss. And then the government asks EAG, okay, so what are you doing right now? And then they just go through the list of our current projects and they have their boxes to tick. And they're reporting to the international community saying that these check boxes are being met. So this is to say that as a NGO, as feet on the ground, we're actively working, and by ensuring we do the work that we love, we're also making sure the island, the country, has the reputation of hitting the targets, excelling at the targets, and basically leading, in some aspects, leading the Caribbean in species conservation and protection. I'd also go a little bit further into this, where a lot of our work as an NGO, again, is funder dependent. And in a lot of the cases, just having knowledge of the wider multilateral agreements, just understanding what the agreements are and what targets we're actively hitting, it really helps us in securing funding. So it might be a bit crude to say, but following these multilateral agreements, ensuring that we're up to date with what is being signed on to, allows us to be able to get the funding to do the work we need to do as well. So you can go to the next slide. So this is just a bit of a bigger backdrop into Redonda. So it's almost a full 30,000 hectares of marine protected area, where the land is, the land is a very small portion of that. It is one of the largest protected areas in the Eastern Caribbean, and just the designation of Redonda has helped Antigua and Barbuda meet the 30 by 30 goal, and EAG is the managing agency. And if you think back of the moonscape picture you saw before, where it was just a brown gray rock, now you're starting to see, in the same image, you're starting to see trees popping up, you're seeing a little bit of vegetation coming up. Since doing the work on Redonda, we've seen a 2,000% increase of vegetation on the island itself, and that's just from, all we did was remove the goats and rats. And then you start seeing the 15 species of land birds starting to return, the endemic species of lizards are exploding, and then you also have in and around 30 globally threatened species that live in and around Redonda. So as our work continues, so our first challenge was eradicating the invasive alien species. The second challenge was getting this area identified as a protected area. And again, we use multilateral agreements and frameworks like the CITES, CITES, where we help identify that, okay, we have endangered species here, we have endemic species here, and then we also have other frameworks and international, I wouldn't say agreements, but international legislation that helps us to identify, okay, this is a key biodiversity area. This helps us go back to the government and say, okay, you've signed on to this treaty, you accept that Antigua and Barbuda has X, Y, and Z key biodiversity areas. We have these important burden areas. We're signed on. The next step is, okay, how do we actually get these areas properly protected to ensure that the international reputation is, one, safe, and then two, that we actually have these species around for the long term. So next slide. A lot of the work we also do we touch a lot on migratory species. So back to Redonda. Redonda has regionally and globally significant colonies of seabirds, including brown boobies, masked boobies, red-footed boobies, the magnificent frigate bird, red-billed tropic bird, and it's internationally recognized as an important birding area. You also have it so that's on the land side, and then you also have it for sea turtles. We see greens, hawksbills, loggerheads utilizing the land around, and leatherbacks transitioning around the island, and then you also have it as an important cetacean area. So next slide. So just to quickly talk about the BBNJ and how we view it at the EAG. So the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, this high seas treaty allowing us to protect the areas outside of national jurisdiction. They have their 4 pillars. I'm sure Dr. Asanali will speak a lot more about this. You have the secure marine genetic resources, the measures such as area-based management tools and marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and then capacity building. When you actually look, so I put these 4 pillars right next to a map of the jurisdictions within the Caribbean. And as you could see, most of us don't have any access to the high seas. We're all smushed together. We're all sharing borders. What importance is this treaty to us? So the previous slide talked a little bit about the migratory species, the species we work with. So you could go on to the next slide quickly. So the species we're talking about are sea turtles, the migratory birds, the cetaceans. We work with a lot of regional entities that attempt to protect these species of conservation concern, these endangered species, throughout the Caribbean. So with sea turtles, we work with the wider Caribbean Sea Turtle Network. With the migratory birds, there's Birds Caribbean. And with cetaceans, there's the Cetacean Conservation Society. While work across all our islands within the Caribbean region, these organizations touch all the islands and they ensure that, okay, sea turtles are protected from Trinidad to Antigua, going straight up to Nicaragua. But what about outside of these waters? Because these organisms share not only borders, but they also exist outside of national borders. Whereas the protection, the work we put into conserving sea turtles in Antigua and Barbuda is wonderful. But as soon as they leave our waters, maybe they go off to Dominica to forage. Okay, we have protected sea turtles in Dominica as well. But what about larger scale areas like the Sargasso Sea? We know when turtles are born, they hightail it to open ocean. They head out to the Sargasso Sea. That's one of the areas where they spend the first 2 years of their lives growing, living. There's no protection for these organisms outside of national jurisdiction. So a lot of the efforts that we put into protecting the seabirds, to preserving cetaceans, to helping out migrant seabird colonies and rejuvenating their populations. As soon as they get out of national jurisdiction or get into nations that don't have the proper protections for them, our work is diminished. So having that network of control both within the jurisdictions and then within these high seas where these populations are also existing, that helps to make sure our work stays relevant for the long term. Next slide. And that's the end of my presentation.